is number one, what kind of music do you like? And number two, is it too hot or too cold? Because you can have a church split over that one. So we just set the temperature and hope you like it. All right. We want to continue our series, Can We Talk? And tonight we want to talk about why work is essential to expanding the kingdom. When God created each one of us, He also gave us primary giftings. Did you know that? You were created with God in mind, or God had you in mind, and He created in you primary giftings. You carry those things around with you to help motivate us to do His work. In other words, you're going to find certain things in your life that you're really going to like to do, and I'm telling you that inward motivation comes from a God that gave you that. There are gifts of mercy, leadership, helps, administration, encouragement, giving, etc. You can find those in Romans chapter 12, and those are called motivational gifts. And all of us have been given gifts, but not all of them. Understand that. Not all of them. Primary and usually one or two. So, therefore, we function better when operating in what God has given to us. Now, let me explain that to you. When you find your sweet spot, or whatever it is, and you find your place of serving wherever that might be, in the church or outside the church, you just simply know that this is where I belong. This is what's happening in my life, and you love it there. But what often happens is this. So therefore, I will function in this, and I'll neglect other things that God wants me to do because there's motivation there, and that's not true. But that doesn't mean because I don't have the primary gift of an evangelist, therefore I'm not supposed to practice sharing my faith. That's just for those evangelist people, you see. That's not for me. Well, according to the Scriptures, it's for all of us. This is the reason the Apostle Paul writes back to Timothy. Now, let me tell you about Timothy and the two books that Paul wrote to Timothy about. These are pastoral books. And the reason that Paul is writing back to Timothy is because Timothy has taken over the church at Ephesus. And the church at Ephesus is about 50,000 strong, as near as we can tell. And so he needs some encouragement. So Paul is writing back to Timothy, and he's saying, Timothy, I want you to pay attention to this, because Timothy was Paul's protege, or he was his student. Timothy's primary gifts were probably pastoring and teaching, so he spent his energies there, and rightfully so. So Paul is telling Timothy, you must practice those primary giftings, but don't stop sharing your faith. Now, I could be reading into the text, but I believe Paul is saying, don't just hang around churched people. Now, why am I saying that? Is it just something that comes to my mind because it fits into this series? No, because Paul was a church planter. And when you read the New Testament, and especially how Paul started churches, he always hung around unchurched people. And he is saying, listen, Timothy, I get it. I know what is easiest for you. But I want you to begin to spend time with unchurched people. You just kind of get in a groove and you start practicing that, and you think that that's what your church life is all about. Friends, I have to be really honest with you. I'm preaching about something I really don't understand. And there's always a tension in that. I mean, if you waited for your pastor or teaching pastors to wait until their life was perfected before we ever spoke about something, you would never get any message. So we're in process too. We're in this thing of learning how to do it ourselves. But I have to be really honest with you. Right now in my life, as near as I can calculate, I have two unchurched friends. And the reason why is because I have sown into the church. And so I have thousands of church friends. And it is really hard to break out of that scenario and how to find unchurched people. And I believe that is exactly the dynamic that's going on in Timothy's life. He has found what it is to be a pastor and all the rest of it, and now he has to break out of that mode and learn how to get back in to the mainstream of what everybody is doing in their life. We are like water. We will seek the path of least resistance. Every one of us. It's just the way we're made. It's easier to do it this way. If doing this work of expanding the kingdom was easy, everyone would be doing it and the world would know. It's just not easy work, and that's why Paul says, do the work of an evangelist, because it is spelled W-O-R-K. It's work. There's a dynamic that takes place when a church decides to reach out, and that first dynamic is this. The workload will immediately increase. You know why? is because now all the energies that were given to the inside of the church, some of those energies are now going to the outside of the church. And I'll say this to every one of you. It takes an incredibly mature church to love the unchurched. You know why? It's because you don't get what you want. It's about other people. I noticed there are no amens on that. But that's what happens. And then the other thing that begins to take place is this. Then you throw the dynamic, and when people start understanding this, we're dealing with people's eternities. It adds another stair of emphasis, and we recognize that we're really playing for all the stakes. And so the energies that we have now that are not just being directed, and this is one of the reasons, friends, I got a lot of comments. Excuse me, I get all choked up when I talk about my counselor. Got a lot of comments last week when I told you that I'm seeing a counselor, emails and people coming up to me and talking, and it was all that good stuff. But I want you to know this is the paradox, and I have lots of paradoxes in my life. But this is a paradox. How do we continue to mature the church and continue to reach out? And it's a really difficult balance to do both. Because we are dealing with people's eternities, and near as I can tell, the heart of God is, I want you to continue to reach out to those people that don't know the Lord. One of the reasons this work is so difficult is basically this. We are dealing with disinterested people. They're not interested in their eternities, and I'll be making more comments about that later. And so when we start to talk to somebody and we find out that they're not interested, what do we feel? I can tell you it's one word: rejection. And when you're rejected, you don't feel like going out and putting your heart on the platter for somebody else to step on it again. And so what the immediate response is to this is that I'll withdraw because I didn't have a receptive audience to what I had to say. Paul is trying to encourage Timothy, do this work. I know it's not easy. Do this work. I want to give us some hints how we can do this work as well. So if you have your little outlines, listen to this in 2 Timothy 4:5. But you, now this is Paul talking to Timothy. I want you to hear this, what Paul is saying to Timothy. But you, keep your head in all situations. How many of you wished that you had kept your head in all situations? It's just multiplied in the ministry. Endure hardship. Now there's one that somebody ought to preach on. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. I had a friend ask me tonight, he says, well, where's your scripture? Because I usually have it on the back. That's it. That's all there is tonight. So 5 ways to work. Number 1 is this. Decide that my faith will not just be about me. Decide that my faith will not just be about me. All of us are driven to a point or a crossroads that will determine what our lives will be about. And let me just tell you about this, friends. When this begins to take place in your life, I want you to know it is not your own ingenuity that is bringing you to this crossroads or this apex in your life. It is God. And God has an ability to bring you to a place, and I'll repeat this again. This kind of an experience with God is repeatable. It's not just once. It's not just once we lay our life down. It's numbers of times that we learn to lay our lives down. And so what happens to us when God brings us to this crossroad, I want you to know these 2 crossroads are marked very clearly. One of them says this, eternal, and the other one says temporary. And when we come to those crossroads in our life, we have to ask ourselves, what is our life going to be about? Is it going to be about the temporal, or is it going to be about eternal things? And as soon as we make that choice, I want you to know that your heart will have a corresponding or correlation type of formation that begins to take place. If you choose eternity, I'm going to start living my life for eternity, what you will find out is that your heart will immediately begin to expand and begin to grow. Because that's where God's heart is. God wants us to think about eternal issues. And so when we start going down that path and we say, God, I'm just going to start thinking about those kind of things in my life, then we begin to recognize that our heart starts doing a certain type of formation. That's why Proverbs says, watch over your heart with all diligence, for out of it flows the issues of life. And there's no greater issue in life than where you're going to spend eternity. And then the second one is this, that when we choose the temporal, then immediately our hearts grow smaller and colder. And you'll begin to think everything that happens in life is just about you. And God will bring you to a place, friends, in your life that he will say these words. Listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 10:39. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In other words, if you'll give your life away for my sake, you're going to find what life is all about. But if you try to keep it and just do everything for yourself, then what you're going to do is absolutely lose it. Had an experience in my life, and believe you me, there are more of them that are happening. But this was one of the most dramatic experiences that I had about these two roads. And it came to the place after I'd started in the ministry in 1981 that the church had grown now to about 200 people, and I was still working for my dad. And he knew that I couldn't stay in the business, so he came to me and basically said, what's going to be your decision? Are you going to stay with me, or are you going to go to the church? And I want you to know that my dad was absolutely supportive of either choice that I was going to make. And so I told him, I said, well, I'll let you know. And so about a week's time after that, I came to him and I said, Dad, I feel like I'm supposed to go to the church. And he says, I think you're making the right choice. He said these words, I'll never forget them. I'll have the papers drawn up so you can sign away your stock and away your position in the company. And I went, sign away? What does that mean, sign away? It's like, oh man, this is big time stuff. I'm really signing it away. And I could take you to 1622 Glenwood in the lobby out there on that long information desk. And Dad, I don't even know what day of the week it was, but it was in the evening. And he came by and he laid those papers out. And those little stickers that says sign here? So I started signing. And he shook my hand and said, it was nice doing business with you. Turned around and walked out. And I want you to know this is exactly what was going on in my mind. It was the most freeing experience I think I've ever had in my life. And at the same time, it was the scariest thing I've ever done. I don't know how God does that. But I want you to know, friends, at times in your life, God will bring you to an apex, and he's just going to ask you, where are you going to go? What are you going to do with your life? Is it going to be about me, or is it going to be about you? So we have to decide that. Is my faith just going to be about me, or is it going to be about other people? What God's called us to. Number 2 is this. Think about where my resources will be spent. Now, here's an interesting one. Think about where my resources will be spent. Where will I be spending the resources God gave me? My time, my energy, my giftings. Caution. Let me talk to you about this caution here that I have. Because when I talk to people about this, what is your giftings, where are your resources going to be spent, and all the rest of it, most of the people in this room immediately go to full-time ministry. And let me tell you something. That is not where God has. About 90% of you will never, ever be in full-time ministry, and you ought to say, thank God. You don't want to be there. And one of the reasons why I really want to kind of develop this whole issue about where you're going to spend your resources is because many of you do have extra time on your plate. You think, well, maybe not. Well, if you cut out some activities, you do. And you're beginning to be drawn towards certain things where we're talking about the sweet spot, where you just know that that's the place that you belong. I happened to watch somebody this week that was ministering, and I was just really on the outside kind of looking in. And as I watched this individual kind of take over the situation and begin to do what they were doing so well, it was just kind of nice to sit back and just watch. That individual has found exactly what they're supposed to do. And it's the first time in history, and I know I'll get in trouble with the bookstore when I say this, but that's where I live most of the time anyway. There's a book that's called From Success to Significance that a guy wrote because of a man by the name of Bob Pax that came up with that particular statement. And he's the man that owns Pax TV. And he just said, I got to a place where I was tremendously successful, but I realized I wasn't doing anything significant. And when this man heard this that wrote the book, said, I've got to write a book about that, and did a whole bunch of research on it, and it's a fabulous read. And here's the point that comes across, that it's the first time in the history of man that man not only has the wealth, but also the health to do something with his life, especially in the second half, simply because he has these kind of resources. And people are just at the point in their life right now where they're asking this question, another boat, another toy, another house, another whatever it might be, just doesn't satisfy anymore. I want to do something that is significant with my life. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves the question, where am I going to spend my resources? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? How is that going to be, as Shalane would say, impactuous upon the people that I'm around? Well, here's where the rubber really meets the road, friends, and we're talking about and just really getting it down to plain, simple matters. Every one of us have to decide, am I going to become more sensitive to my surroundings? Because when I become more sensitive to my surroundings, here's exactly what will happen. Your gifting will begin to manifest itself in the condition of what other people's lives are actually taking place. In other words, when you see somebody that is off in the corner by themselves at some kind of party, and you recognize that that person is discouraged, the person with the gift of encouragement is naturally drawn to that person because they want to figure out what in the world is going on with them. You see, and that's where your resources are really going to be dialed up and used, is simply because we are on all the time. It's not that we go into a party or we go into some kind of, social situation and then we're just dialed out of it. We actually are dialed up because we're sensing what God's doing in the room. And the more you use it, the more you will be aware of what God is actually doing in the room. And so you will walk over and you'll begin to ask them questions. And like I talked about last week, you'll start asking questions, saying things that you never thought of before. And it's because that gifting now is being engaged because a person needs the gift. By the way, while I'm talking about this, you don't carry the gift. You don't have it in your hip pocket. It manifests itself at the time because the gift is not for you. The gift is for the person that's receiving what you have to say. You see, and so you're in that position there. So, and then you got these other people that are prophetic, that have the old black and white syndrome. And they see you wallowing in your self-pity, and then they come around and just read your mail, and it's like bullets going off on you, and they can't even stop. And it's like, wow, it's just exactly what I needed to hear, but could you just slow down a little bit? Too much truth. And that's the way that this thing starts to operate, as we begin to recognize at this particular point in our lives that now I'm truly going to be engaged. But here's the coup de grace. Here's the bottom line of everything that I'm saying. We have to ask ourselves this question almost every time we get into those kind of situations. Am I willing to be spent? And see, if I took a survey of us tonight, probably 100% of us could register on the negative side. There have been times when I know I was supposed to engage and I didn't do it and walked away from that. And then on the other side of this survey, because we are fair and just in this church, is that you would probably answer, there were times that I did engage, and what a wonderful blessing that was. John Wimber used to say this, who was the founder of the Vineyard. He'd always take out a quarter or something in his pocket and he'd go, we're a piece of change in God's pocket, and he can spend us anytime he wants to. It's always been a good illustration. The question is, do we want to be spent? And God has that freedom to ask us, and we also have the freedom to go, don't think so. But if we're going to do the work of an evangelist, then we have to be engaged at those moments. And it just means that we're on all the time. Sometimes that gets wearying. Number 3 is this: choose to be bold when needed. Choose to be bold when needed. Sometimes you and I will be one whom God will use to bring people across the line of faith. We haven't done anything for these people. We've not prayed for them. We have not developed relationships with them or anything else. But at some point, you and I will just be asked by the Holy Spirit to ask the big question to this person. Do you want to cross the line of faith? I want to give you a story that happened to me a couple years ago. Vicki Crabtree, who is Marilyn's assistant, who used to be my assistant, and Marilyn stole her away. And I have a great assistant. If you're here, Joni, I love you. I could get myself in big trouble there, couldn't I? And Tab passed away this last December, her husband. And he was diagnosed with cancer. And the day that he was diagnosed with cancer, obviously, it was It was advanced. And so after they came out of the consultation with the doctor, Vicky said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to go see Dan. I want to go see Dan. And so they drove down here to the church. And they just called and said, Tab wants to see you. So we came in, they sat down, and Vicky and Tab began to tell me what had just happened. And the picture did not look good. And friends, I don't do this. I don't do this. And I heard the story, and I just said, Tab, do you want to cross the line of faith today? You want to do that? And he goes, yeah, that's what I want to do. And man, he just prayed a prayer that was just incredibly awesome. Vicki and I were just slobbering all over the place and weeping and all the rest of it. And Tab really prayed the Lord. Well, this last week, I went out to his grave. And I'm not big on visiting people's graves. I mean, my mom's here, and I'm not big on it. But I went out there because I heard the headstone had gotten in, and so I drove in and went over to his grave and looked at the grave. And the scripture that ran through my mind was this: to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. I know where Tab is. I know where he is. I didn't do a thing, friends. I mean, Vicky, godly, wonderful Vicky, prayed and prayed and prayed for her husband, and I just happened to be there when the fruit fell off the tree. But it's just one of those things that you recognize that once in a while in your life, you're going to be tabbed by God to say, will you ask the question? And that's the work of an evangelist. Are you going to do it? Are you going to cross? And see, that's something that all of us just have to deal with. Are we going to be courageous enough just to go, I feel this stirring in my heart, and you guys know what it is to it. I feel this stirring in my heart, and I just think I need to ask the question. Ask the question. Do you want to cross the line of faith? And then have this wonderful experience when they do. Or have your heart torn out when they don't. See, and that's both sides of this thing. You find out that it happens that way. All right? Number 4 is this. Meditate on stories and illustrations that helped you. Meditate on stories and illustrations that helped you. When you hear stories or illustrations that move you or touch you, it's because that's where you are in your life. Did you hear that? When you hear stories or illustrations that touch you and just move you, that's because where you are in your life. I know that feeling. I know exactly what that is. To be sitting in an auditorium like this, or to be listening to somebody across the coffee table, and they begin to describe to me something that I feel but I have not had language for. It is such a relief, isn't it? To go, that's exactly what I feel, but I just have never had words to it. I want you to know and understand this dynamic, friends, that when that experience happens to you, you own that story. That illustration is yours. Now, let me tell you why I believe that. It's because God is the author of all truth. I was reading a book one time about church. I've read so many books about church. I just have all sorts of books about church. And in this one book, the title of this one chapter was this, and this is exactly how it reads: "Swiped with pride from the best." We people, as pastors, are a pack of thieves. I'll try it on this side of the room. We pastors are a pack of thieves. We just go around. You'll find things out there you'll find in other churches that we write and do all sorts of things because somebody's got a really good idea. Listen to this statement, friends. There is no copyright on truth. God owns it. As a matter of fact, let me take it one step further. Nobody has ever created truth. All we ever do is discover it. And it's all God's truth, you see. And so when these kind of illustrations and these things begin to happen in your life, you begin to recognize at this particular time, I really feel identified with what that person is saying, and because it fits with my life. When that happens, you own that truth. That's why Paul told Timothy, follow me as I follow Christ. I've developed things that you don't have to work through. Use this, and it will help you in your life. You see? And so it becomes a point that all of us have to just dial into these illustrations. Let me give you a couple of them. Number one comes from Bill Hybels, who's the pastor at Willow. And he said these words years ago, and it's just one of these illustrations that just says it, just nails it. I mean, he just puts it down. He says, all other religions of the world is spelled do. If you want to get to God, you have to do these things to get to God. But when it comes around to Christianity, the word is spelled done. Because it's all done for you. And there's just something about that that just goes, oh, that describes it. All I have to do is receive it. I don't have to do anything for it. See, and there's just something about that when he says that. I don't care if Bill Hybels said it or President Bush said it. When it means something to you, that's yours. I'll give you another illustration that came out of the leadership conference, which I'd like to bring up the leadership conference. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. I used manipulation last week, and it didn't work well. So I've gone to the next step. And here's the next step, is that I had Joni find all of your names and addresses and pictures of those of you that have not signed up for the conference. And that's one of the reasons that we've hired Ronnie, is that we really did do a background check on him. And he does drive-by shootings really, really well. And it'll be painless, and you won't know what hit you, but if you're not here, I'm sorry, I've warned you. As a matter of fact, I've pasted these pictures up in Ronnie's wall, and I've numbered them in sequence as to which ones go first. And this is what I'll do. I'll do your funeral, and I hate funerals. And a word to the wise is sufficient. And that's what I'd hate to say at your funeral, is that this person's last act was not wise. And that's why they lay before you. So anyway, sign up if you haven't. But anyhow, Ken Blanchard, back to what I was trying to say. Ken Blanchard, who wrote the 1 Minute Manager, said this when he was coming to faith. As a matter of fact, Bob Pax, the guy that I was just telling you about that came up with the, from success to significance, was trying to lead Ken to the Lord. And Ken just couldn't get it. It just didn't make sense to him. And so finally, Bob came up with this illustration. He said, Ken, I think I've got it for you. On a scale of 1 to 100, how good do you think you actually are? He said, well, I know I'm not perfect. And he's a very gentle, humble man. But he said, probably on a scale of 1 to 100, I'm at probably 65. And this Bob Pax just nails him. And he said, well, it's Jesus that made up the difference. It's Jesus that made up the difference. And Ken goes, I get it. I get it. Now, I don't know what your stories are. I don't know what illustrations you might use. But friends, like I talked about last week, you have a story. And some of these illustrations you won't have long. I mean, there'll be a window of opportunity, and we're going to talk about this next week. There will be a window of opportunity that you can shoot through in there, but it's got to be short. And when you use illustrations like that, people get it. Use illustrations that you've heard if you're going to do the work of an evangelist, okay? Number 5 is this. Have the attitude of a coach. Have the attitude of a coach. No one wants to feel like they've become your project or that they have been targeted by you. Have you ever had that? You ever had somebody that's, you would be perfect in my downline? Are we connecting? Are we communicating here? It's like, I don't want to be in your downline. I've targeted you. Oh, well. Anyway, probably 6 people just got up and walked out. All right. That's why it's important to work on the ones the Lord is working on. And we'll be talking about this next week. I mean, when Jesus is actually working on somebody, it's a lot easier to work on them. We need to decide what kind of mindset we will have when we do this kind of work of sharing our faith. Sometimes I think we as Christians feel like our only job is to close the deal. Used car salesman. Got to get your name on the bottom line. To try and get people to say the sinner's prayer or lead them down the Romans road. And some of you don't even know what that is. And doing all this, now notice these words, friends. Here's what we do, is we apply pressure. That is not good. That is not what the target audience that we're trying to influence into the kingdom is wanting to hear, is some kind of pressure that we're putting on them. As a matter of fact, I will say to every one of us, and I think this is very true because I think instinctively this is the way that you and I were created, is that we resist being pushed. That's why we are like sheep, is because we are supposed to be led, not pushed, you see. And so the idea is that when people are trying to push you, there's this natural resistance that comes up and saying, I'm not going to go that way. Now, let me tell you what I'm trying to get across here. Is that I don't think any of us really understand what it is when it comes around to the free will that God has actually given us. The incipiency of the will, or that you are and I am a sentient being that has the ability to know right from wrong and choose what we want to do in our lives. My uncle, who was the coach up here at Grand Junction High School when I was in high school, and I might add, I think was a fabulous coach. And he used to say this, and I'd hear him talking to other coaches and stuff, and he would make this statement: I would much rather have a young man that had no talents but a great heart, rather than a kid with a lot of talents and no heart. And the reason why is I can teach the kid with no talents because he has a heart, and the reason I can't teach the kid that has all the talents is because he doesn't care. That's pretty amazing. And here's the point, friends. God created us to have a free will. And God says, I want somebody to love me out of their own free will, not because I have manipulated them. See, there's a difference between manipulation and influence. And that's the difference between somebody that wants to coach somebody into the kingdom rather than trying to be somebody that's going to drive them into the kingdom. And here's the point. I can manipulate anybody in this room. All I have, as a matter of fact, I can get you to say anything. All I have to do is get a big enough weapon of manipulation and you will say it. See, I have now for all you people that hate guns, just take this as an illustration, and I'm not going to blow anybody away, and neither is Ronnie and all the rest of it. But I have a .357 Magnum at my house. And I could come up to you and say, tell me that I am the best pastor that you have ever met. And you'll say, no, I don't think so. And then I pull out this gun and I pull it to your head and I say, now say it. And most of you, except for some of you strong-willed people, would say, you're the best pastor I've ever met. Now, the question is, does that mean anything? No. Why? It's because we know what is manipulating that person. We know what it is behind them that's making them say what they want to say. And friends, that's exactly the way it is with God. You don't think that God couldn't, just really pull out some huge manipulation on us? And just say, if you don't do this, man, I'm going to do away with you. And everybody go, come on, And here's the point that I want to really make to you about this, friends, is that a decision that's made under pressure doesn't last any longer than the pressure. I'll give you a quick story here. Years ago, I went into the Colorado River, 1969. And it was cold. It was wintertime. Scared me to death. I got right with God for about 2 weeks. And when the fear was gone, so was my relationship with the Lord. Because it was all out of fear. Now, here's the point that I want to make. You can never, ever make somebody else love you. You can't do it. If somebody doesn't love you, there's nothing in the world that you can do to make that person love you. And that is called incipiency or freedom of the will. And it's painful. It's extremely painful to have somebody go, I just don't care about you. And see them walk away from your life. But a good coach recognizes that I'm here for you. And every one of us will get to a place in our lives that we will begin to understand that there are teachable moments. And when there are teachable moments, the question comes up, what kind of a mindset will you have towards that individual? Will you be a manipulator or will you be a coach? And it is so much easier when people start asking you the questions, when they're in those teachable moments, and you become the coach. Well, this is what happened in my life, and this is what I was going through. And at those moments, you recognize that you have insight to their life that you don't have at other times. I want the worship team to come up. So here's what I want us to think about. It just doesn't, and here I'm talking about my own trade. It just doesn't do any good to preach to somebody that doesn't want to be preached to. It just doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any good to try and convince somebody that they need to love God when they don't want to be convinced of it. But something really does happen in a person's life when they're at a crisis moment and they're going, I'm really open to this. And I'm going to give you 5 ways next week. God and I have worked this thing out about 5 ways. I'm going to give you five different opportunities that, that you can walk in through the door. And you will become a coach. Because you know why? You've developed a relationship with that person, and they know that you're not there just trying to manipulate them into the kingdom. You're really there because you love them. I want you to stand with me. And here's what I wanted you to do as we sing this last song. I just want you to think about your mindset. What is my mindset when it comes to sharing my story? Am I going to be a used car salesman? Or going to be a coach? I'm going to open myself up to be used by God, to be spent like He wants me to be spent? Or am I going to withdraw myself? The question is, I don't want to go on with this point, but the question really does come to, friends, the kingdom expands one person at a time. And the question has to be asked, are we going to be that person that's going to allow the Holy Spirit to spend us in the way that He wants to? I want you to worship the Lord, and I'll come back and pray with you.